good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, partners, and friends. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Kapar Conde, Associate Program Officer for Traditional Knowledge at the Secretariat of the CBD, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Due to unexpected flight change, Ms. Jihun Lee is not able to join us today. She sends her sincerest apologies. Before we start, I would like to inform that we have interpretation for this webinar in Spanish, French. In addition, the webinar will be recorded and made available at the CBT website. To start with this webinar, I would like to give the floor to Mr. David Cooper, Acting Executive Secretary of the Convention, for his opening remark. David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kapak, and good day to everyone. To begin with, we respectfully acknowledge the Ghanaian Gahaga people, the people of the Flint, the Mohawk people. The Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity is located in the ancestral territory of the Mohawk people, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations and peoples. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this important webinar, and it's good to see online representatives of parties, indigenous peoples and local communities and stakeholders. The purpose of this webinar is to share information on key issues for the consideration at the upcoming meeting of the Working Group on Article 8J and related provisions later this year. So that means we're going to look at the preparation of the new programme of work on Article 8J and possible options for the institutional arrangements going forward. As I'm sure you're all aware, at COP15 in December, here in Montreal, the Conference of the Parties adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And a number of other important decisions related to the framework were adopted as well, including those on monitoring of progress, resource mobilization, capacity building and development, and technical and scientific cooperation, and digital sequence information, among others. I think it's fair to say that at COP15, we saw the biggest and most broadest and universal recognition of the important role of indigenous peoples and local communities for the effective implementation of the convention, for effective conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and also recognition of the need to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities are protected and advanced. And this was reflected in the Kunming-Montreal framework as the first of a number of cross-cutting considerations for the framework as a whole, but also in specific targets, such as Target 1 on spatial planning, Target 3 on protected areas, Targets 5 and 9 on sustainable use, with a specific recognition of customary sustainable use, as well as Target 21 on knowledge and Target 22 on effective participation in decision-making. The updating of the programme of work on Article 8J and other provisions related to indigenous peoples and local communities, I believe this provides a really important opportunity to build on these foundations in the GBF framework and to help operationalize them. Obviously, it's also critical that the new programme of work is developed in a way that truly reflects the rights and interests of indigenous peoples and local communities and enables their effective contributions to the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So COP15 adopted an ambitious framework. Let us now work together to implement that framework. And let us embrace this opportunity to move towards a sustainable future for all through engaging dialogues and collaboration with indigenous peoples and local communities. I'll now leave you in the good hands of my colleagues Kapak and Worku. I hope that you find this to be a useful and interesting webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for setting the scene for this webinar. David needs to leave this webinar, so soon do another engagement. We thank him for his time and intervention in this webinar. Maybe he might join us a bit later, but again, thank you so much, David, for this opening remark. Well, the CBD Secretariat is convening this webinar in order to provide information on the process of developing a new program of work and institutional arrangement for Article 8J and other provisions of the Convention related to indigenous people and local communities. In particular, this webinar aims to discuss the rationale, objectives, and methodology regarding the development of the new program of work. I will be providing some background regarding to the process of the for the new program of work, a background of the current program of work. Then Woku will present the institutional arrangement, and we are pleased to have with us Lucy Mullengape, who will provide the initial perspective of indigenous people in this process. And then we will follow up with a Q&A. We invite you to provide your questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. Let me share my screen now to start my presentation. There. My presentation has 3 parts. The first one describes the process, including the important dates for the development of the new program of work. Second, it describes background information of the current program of work and briefly describes the 2 annexes of decision 15/10, which are the basis for discussions for the new program of work. In these slides, you can appreciate the process toward the next session of the working group on Article 8J, which, among other things, will discuss the new program of work. Regarding the peer review process of Annex 2 on the draft possible elements of the new program of work, the 11th session of the working group requests to make available Annex 2 for peer review, which includes possible elements of the new program of work. We thank parties, stakeholders, and indigenous people who already provide their comments via the peer review. We have extended the deadline for submissions. So the new deadline is March 31. We hope that this extra time will allow for new submissions. And the peer review results will be available for the Ad-Hoc Technical Expert Group. To pursue decision 15/10, paragraph 7 on the Ad-Hoc Technical Expert Group, or ATEC. This ATEC will meet in June 2030. The ATEC has the mandate to further elaborate possible elements, tasks, actions for the new program of work and institutional arrangement and modus operandi. Via notification, we have invited parties, IPLCs, and relevant organizations to nominate experts for the ATEC. The composition of the ATEC is 3 experts per region nominated by parties, 2 representatives from IPLCs from each of the 7 sociocultural regions, as well as no more 6 other organizations. The deadline for submit the nomination is April 7 this year. The 12th session of the working group on Article 8J is planned to meet in October or November at the end of this year. The main substantive agenda item for the session is the new program of work. But the ATEC, the results from the ATEC will be as well transmitted to the next session of the working group, which in turn will prepare recommendation for COP15 on this issue. Important issues for the working group as mandated by COP15 are the in-depth dialogue on the roles of language and intergenerational transmission of traditional knowledge, innovation, and practices, as well the progress of the implementation of the current program of work, and the review and update of the for TK traditional knowledge indicators. It is planned to invite parties, indigenous people, and stakeholders to via submissions, request your views and information on these agenda items, all of them with a planned deadline of 14 April, except for the submissions on indicators with the deadlines 5th May. In these slides, we just see some of the important, again, deadlines. The peer review ends on 31 March, the Ad-Hoc nomination 7 April, the planned submissions for the next session of the working group, April 14, and the submissions from the TK indicators 5th May. Just to provide a background of the program of work, the working group on Article 8J and related provision was established by COP4 in 1998. It has its initial mandate includes six elements, which the most important are to provide advice to COP relating to the implementation of Article 8J and related provisions. Also to provide advice to COP on measures to strengthen cooperation at the international level among indigenous people and local communities, to review the implementation of the priority task of COP of the program of work, and it was as well mandated to develop the program of work on Article 8J and related provisions. In its first session, it developed this program of work, which then it was adopted by COP5 in 2000. And in 2010, by COP10, this program of work was revised and include a new task. In these slides, we can see the progress update and progress toward the implementation of the working group. In regards to task 1, sorry. This invites parties to take measures to enhance and strengthen the capacity of indigenous people to effectively be involved in decision making. These tasks remain a prerogatives of parties, and in the experience from the Secretariat, developing and least developed parties were supported by the Secretariat and donors to training and capacity building and development programs for IPLCs and governments. This provides a good platform to allow a dialogue between official party representatives and indigenous people. In regards to target 2, parties to develop appropriate mechanism, guidelines, legislation, and other initiatives to foster and promote effective participation of indigenous people, as reported during SABSTA 3. Only 10% of the 6 national reports mentioned engagement of IPLCs in the SABS process. So there is still greater efforts is required to ensure the effective participation of indigenous peoples to review and implement the SABS. In regards to task 4, similarly to task 2, the adoption of a specific measure and mechanisms for indigenous people responds to unique and diverse national situations or national context. Target 7, 10, and 12 were implemented in an integrate manner by a decision of COP, decision 12/12D. The result of this development produced the Motsukwal voluntary guidelines for the development of mechanism, legislation, and other appropriate initiatives to ensure prior and informed consent, free prior and informed consent, and approval on involvement, depending on national circumstances of IPLCs to access their knowledge. Including fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of traditional knowledge, and reporting and prevention of unlawful appropriation of traditional knowledge. These guidelines were adopted by COP 13. And finally, in regards to task 15, the working group and eventually COP adopt the Rhodes Raki voluntary guidelines on reputation of traditional knowledge. And in regards to the new task from 2010, as well, the working group and COP15 adopt the global plan of action on customized sustainable use. At COP15 in decision 10 slides 43, COP decided to revise the multi-year program of work on Article 8J, retiring and completing or supersede task 3, 5, 9, and 15, as postponed task 7, 11, 13, 14, and 17. To time, I will move to the the outcomes from the working group, and these are the voluntary guidelines developed for different issues, 3 of them regarding traditional knowledge. As we know, the Ad-Hoc voluntary guidelines to conduct cultural, environmental, and social impact assessment regarding development processes to take place on or impact sacred sites and lands and waters traditionally occupied or used by indigenous people and local communities. Tariwari Code of Ethic Conduct to ensure the respect for cultural intellectual heritage of indigenous people and local communities. Most cultural voluntary guidelines on the already mentioned, and as well the Saki voluntary guidelines on repatriation and the glossary of relevant terms and concept within the context of Article 8J and related provisions. Yeah, and these are the outcomes of the working group on Article 8J. Just to move in to the COP15 slides 10 decision. As already David mentioned, the roles of contribution of indigenous people and local communities, it was discussed as a cross-cutting issues in the discussion of the CUMIN Montreal Global Availability Framework. There were several of these issues reflected in several elements called targets of the GBF. And COP15 also adopted the process to develop a new program of work, which is reflected in the decision 15/10, which include 2 annexes that are the basis for the discussion of the new program of work. Just also highlight that COP15 also adopted the joint program of work on links between biological and cultural diversity. So very briefly, the Annex 1 of decision 15/10 includes the objective general principle. The objective of the program of work aims to promote within the framework of the convention a just implementation of Article 8J and related provision at the local, national, regional, and international levels, and also to ensure the full and effective participation of IPLCs at all stages of the and levels of its implementation, ensuring the ongoing recognition of the unique association that indigenous peoples and local communities have with the convention and its protocol. In regards to the general principles, there are 7, ensuring the IPLC participation through the state of identification and implementation of the program of work, including women engaged from IPLCs in all the program activities. 2, respect traditional knowledge and promote collaboration between knowledge systems in biodiversity policies. 3rd, implementation from a holistic approach that respects IPLC's connection with their territories and rights to control their knowledge. 4, to use ecosystem approach for equitable conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. 5th, obtain free prior informed consent to share an ABS. 6, access to traditional knowledge should be subject to free prior informed consent. And finally, monitoring the implementation to traditional knowledge indicators and continue the partnership with relevant organizations. Annex 2 contains as well 6 sections. The first section on sustainable use, the second section on conservation and restoration, the third section sharing of benefits for genetic resources, the fourth section of knowledge and culture, the fifth on the protection of indigenous people and local communities and traditional knowledge, innovation and practices, including through application of guidelines and standards for further advance on Article 8J and related provisions, and the sixth element, the full and effective participation of indigenous people. This annex is again under peer review process, which ends in March 31, which will invite you again to send us your comments if you haven't already. All these sections, or what are the suggested activities within these sections, are brackets, and again the peer review ends on March 31st. With that, I stop here and thank you for your attention, and I would like to invite Woku to his remarks on the institutional arrangement. Woku, you have the floor.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Kapaj, and a good day for the distinguished participants of this webinar. So as you heard from Kapaj, my role today is to take you through briefly to the proposed institutional arrangements for the implementation of the new program of work, which is under development for Article 8J and related provisions. You have heard how when the working group, the existing working group, the ad hoc working group was established. It was a long time ago, and sometime 25 years ago in 1998 by COP4. And after its establishment, the working group was convened and developed its work program, and that was submitted as recommendation for working group for COP5 in 2000. And that was the working group, the work program that was developed for the working group since. But of course, as Kapaj took us through, this program of work has gone through some amendment sometime in 2010. That is aligned with, in order to make it align with a new strategic plan that was adopted at that time at COP10 in 2010. So far, this working group has held, as you all know, 11 meetings. So it is roughly one meeting per biennium over the 24-25 years of its existence. And now I think the working group is wrapping up its work. The existing program of work is supposed to be completed before COP16. And COP16 is the timeline where the new program of work, as well as the institutional arrangement for the implementation of that program of work, will be considered and adopted. From the discussions that were held so far over the last 3 years, there are certain specific institutional arrangements that came out from these discussions. You may look at these specific institutional arrangements that are under consideration in under the decision of COP. that was made at COP14, decision 1417. If you especially look at paragraph 9 of that decision, that you see 3 major options of institutional arrangements listed there and briefly described. So according to this list and according to the discussions to date, the first option is establishing a subsidiary body. A subsidiary body on Article 8J and related provisions. Well, when we say a subsidiary body here, of course, the working group on Article 8J that we had since the last 25 years was also a subsidiary body, but it was an ad hoc subsidiary body. It was not a permanent type of subsidiary body. A permanent type of subsidiary bodies that we have under the CBD, as you know, are SUBSTA, which is established actually by the treaty, by the convention itself, and the subsidiary body on implementation, which was established recently by the decision of the COP. So these are the permanent type of subsidiary bodies, and this first option is referring to a subsidiary body of this nature. So of the similar to SUBSTA, similar to SBI. When it comes to the mandate of this subsidiary body, it would remain more or less the same. I mean, the gist of the mandates remain the same. It's to provide advice to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It is to make recommendations on how to implement, how to expedite the implementation of the new program of work that's going to be adopted. But there's a slight difference this time. This subsidiary body would be a little bit different from the working group on Article 8J in a way that it will, of course, be under the subsidiary body of the Convention on Biological Diversity of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention, but it would also be called upon to address issues by the governing bodies of the 2 protocols that we have, by the COPMOP of the Nagoya Protocol, by the COPMOP of the Cartagena Protocol. So this will be an added feature that if this option is going to be finally agreed, then the mandate, the scope of mandate of this subsidiary body includes accepting and undertaking, when it is requested, activities and tasks assigned by the governing bodies of these protocols. Otherwise, it remains generally, as I said, the mandate would remain the same, but of course, with a new program of work. I mean, essentially, the substance of the program of work emanates or originates from the program of work that is going to be adopted. So when I say that the mandate remains the same, it is the objective of the subsidiary body, and it is in the sense of the objective of the subsidiary body. What would be its purpose? The purpose is to provide advice. The purpose is to implement the work plan that's going to be adopted by the Conference of the Parties. The purpose is to accelerate the actions that parties need to undertake in order to implement the program of work that they agree to implement at the national level, at the local level. So in that sense, it remains the same as we are now having under the working group on Article 8J, but as I said, with a slight change or configuration in terms of the scope of its mandate. When it comes to the modus operandi is a mode of operation, and we have enough precedents for what a modus operandi would look like or should be for a subsidiary body under the convention. We have well-developed experience under the SBSTA. SBSTA has its own subsidiary body, and we have also an experience from a subsidiary body on implementation. By and large, it would be similar to the modus operandi of this new subsidiary body on Article 8J, if it's going to be agreed, would be more or less similar to what we have as modus operandi for SBSTA and for SPI. As some of you may remember or may know, in the modus operandi of SBSTA as well as SBI, the fundamental, the first rule is that the rules of procedure of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention applies with the necessary adjustments to these subsidiary bodies. So what we call mutatis mutandis. So the rules of procedure of the COP will apply also to this subsidiary body if and when it is established. SBSTA has its own bureau. This is also a modus operandi issue. And the bureau is comprised of 2 representatives from each of the regions. But of course, the chairperson is elected by the Conference of the Parties. This is based on the rules of procedure that we have now. In the rules of procedure, there is a rule which says that unless otherwise decided by the Conference of the Party itself, the Conference of the Party elects the chair of subsidiary bodies or a subsidiary body. So we expect this subsidiary body, the new subsidiary body, if and when it is agreed and established, to have its chairperson elected by the Conference of the Parties, unless there is a different decision. Whether it will have its own bureau will also be discussed, will also be considered through this process that we are having now until COP16. And of course, the final decision will be made by COP16 itself, whether a separate bureau may be needed for this subsidiary body. As you know, SBI doesn't have its own bureau, unlike SBSTA, but the Conference of the Parties Bureau, the COP Bureau, acts as the bureau of SBI. So there is also an opportunity or an option for this new subsidiary body on Article 8J to have the Conference of the Parties Bureau being acting as its bureau. By the way, that is the case with the existing working group on Article 8J. The ad hoc working group on Article 8J is being overseen by the Conference of the Parties Bureau. It is the president which chairs the proceedings of the ad hoc working group meetings. It is the bureau of the conference of the COP, which is also acting as bureau at the bureau of the ad hoc. So there is no difference if that option is going to be taken up. Then we have well-established, we have well-developed experience that would continue easily. In fact, in the existing system, in the existing governance system, in the COP Bureau, when the working group is in session, there is, of course, the official bureau is the COP Bureau, but there is what we call, there's what has been developed over time to have friends of the Bureau working with the COP Bureau in order to facilitate the discussions, the work of the proceedings of the working group at each meeting. And friends of the group, friends of the Bureau are elected by the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities group based on regional representation. The regions, the number of regions is not exactly overlapping with the regions that we usually use, for example, for the purpose of constituting the COP Bureau. We follow the UN regional grouping, whereas for the friends of the Bureau purposes and for IPLC's purposes, we use different regional grouping. About 7 groups exist in order to give adequate representation for the indigenous peoples and local communities around the world. So that will be even if this subsidiary body on Article 8J is going to be the one which is going to be elected as an institutional arrangement, then I think this practice would continue regardless of whether it will have its own bureau or it will continue to use the Bureau of the Conference of the Parties. Now let me take you to the second option that we have on the table. The second option is that the one which is the continuation of the existing working group as it is in terms of its structure, its governance system, etc. The ad hoc working group will continue, but of course with a new mandate based on the new work program or program of work that's going to be adopted. Otherwise, the working is the nitty-gritties, how this working group functions is expected to remain the same. So this is the other option. The other option is to continue with the structure, with the institutional arrangement that we have in place and which has worked for several years now, but with a new mandate based on the new working group. The third one is integrating the functions, the work of the work on the implementation of Article 8J into the work of the existing subsidiary bodies, including the COP itself, and with no specific and distinct institutional setup to oversee this work. That means Substar would have a role, SBI would have a role, an enhanced role actually, and the work program which is going to be adopted, which is going to be agreed, will be undertaken by the existing institutional arrangements, by the existing subsidiary bodies that we have, and the participation of indigenous peoples and local community groups or representatives should be enhanced, because the one thing that over the years experience under the working group, the ad hoc working group on Article 8J has proven is how it really facilitated the full participation of indigenous representatives of indigenous peoples and local communities. That should not be lost. So that is why, if you look at 14.7, the decision that identified these three options on the basis of the recommendation of the working group itself last time, it says, applying the enhanced participation mechanism used by the ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J and related provisions for the participation of representatives of indigenous peoples and local communities when addressing matters of direct relevance to indigenous peoples and local communities in the subsidiary bodies, then ensure and ensuring their effective participation, and to fully integrate, this is the key word, to fully integrate them into the work of the convention. So there will be no distinct institutional arrangement, but with enhanced participation, the existing institutional arrangements that function, that work for the convention, that work for the protocol, in the form of SBSTA, in the form of SBI, will also be involved in an increased way in implementing the work program that's going to be adopted for the purpose of implementing Article 8J and related provision issues. So essentially, these are the three institutional arrangements that are under consideration: subsidiary body, the continuation of the existing ad hoc working group on Article 8J, and the third one is integrating the work. Once the work program is adopted, integrating and picking up all the works in the existing subsidiary bodies, in the existing system under the CBD, without making any distinction for, as far as the institution is concerned, for Article 8J. Probably this could be supported by the integrated nature of indigenous peoples and local communities related issues in the GBF, because the development of the new work program is expected to be based on, or to take into account, essentially the global biodiversity, what the global biodiversity framework provides for in terms of facilitating the work under Article 8J and related provisions. So, the integration in the GBF of IPLC issues is expected to be replicated, to be reflected in the integration of these activities, or the activities that emanate from the goals, from the targets that, in fact, you have heard earlier, that were identified earlier into the work of the existing institutional arrangements. So these are the choices, and you will continue these discussions through the ATEG. You will continue these discussions through SBI, and then the final decision will be made, of course, by COP16 on what kind of institutional arrangement may be appropriate to undertake to move forward with the implementation of the new program of work and to implement Article 8J and related provisions. Let me stop there, and thank you so much, but I will take, of course, any questions that you may have. Thank you, Kapaj, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Woku, for that presentation and the overview of the options for the institutional arrangement and modus operandi for the participation of indigenous people and local communities in the work of the convention as identified by COP14. I take that last comment, right? Something that it shouldn't be lost within the three options. It's the enhanced participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. That will actually set the tone for our next speaker. Just before I give the floor to Lucy, I just would like to recall all of you, if you have any question, please do insert them in the Q&A box. We will be reading those at the end of the webinar. And now I'm the great pleasure to invite Ms. Lucy Mulinke, co-chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. She will reflect on the perspective from the IFB on regards to the future program of work and the institutional arrangement. Lucy, you have the floor, and I will be sharing the presentation.
Thank you very much, Kapak, and thank you, Dr. Woko, for that explanation. That is, it was really very interesting to listen to it. And I want to say to everyone, hello and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. And I would like also to take this opportunity, as we've not had time to talk with the Secretariat, to congratulate David Cooper for his being appointed as the acting executive secretary, and also take the opportunity to say thank you to Elizabeth Marema and congratulate her for a new appointment in UNEP. Now, International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity has been going on with its work, trying to put up some of the discussions that we've already had presented by David Cooper, Kapak, and also Mr. Woku. And we really thank the Secretary of the Convention for this opportunity that we bring our perspectives to future program of work and institutional arrangements and their modus operandi, as he had already explained. The IFB is an indigenous caucus composed by members from 7 cultural regions of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We have Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Caribbean, Pacific, Arctic, North America, and the Central and the Arctic area are currently discussing these processes internally among ourselves in the webinars and also at the regional level. The IFB, as we say, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, had done significant contribution to the negotiations of the current program of work on Article 8J and related provisions. It is important to remember that in the Traditional Knowledge and Biological Diversity workshop that was held way back in November, and that was around 24th to 28th of November in 1997, were about 300 attendees. We had 62 governments and 148 indigenous representatives discussing and adopting the recommendation for the program of work of the implementation of Article 8J and its related provision. And that's why we have that long history where we became a long way developing this particular work. The establishment of an open-ended intersessional working group to address issues related to implementation of the Article 8J and related provision. It was a full and effective participation of indigenous peoples, local communities, and governments in the identification of tasks for the program of work and the recommendations and characteristics of the body with a mandate to work on Article 8J and its related provision on the working program on 8J. Thanks to this process, because we were able to really come a long way. In 1998, we have the decision that I think Kapak had already brought up, that particular decision on how the ad hoc open-ended working group to address implementation of 8J. And it gave the mandate, and as Mr. Woku has also explained, how we went from COP4 to COP5 in 2000 in Nairobi. And for us, there was an historical moment which gave birth to the current program of work for the implementation of Article 8J and related provision. And for the working group on Article 8J, several mechanisms to promote the full and effective participation of IPLCs indigenous people and local communities in the work of the convention. It remains live after maybe about 22 or 25 years, even with some pending tasks that are still there. And as we see, when we look at Kunming program and look at the discussion on 8J, we still see that these are the same things that are being discussed. And the new program of work, which we already look at it and been discussing on it, should be keep the commitment and ambition of the conference is to implement Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We are also saying that the new program of work should not be considered in isolation. The tasks should be based on the goals and targets of the Cunningham Global Framework, which is very, very important for us. And of course, after discussing that, we have these general comments that we really want to bring up to the tasks that are going to go on from now, so that we can be able to continue the work. And for IFB, the development of the work, as I've already indicated, took a lot of work when we were discussing it, by submission, participation, meeting, and lobbying. The outcome is ambitious and demanding now. And we need to develop a strong new program of work that keep the commitments and ambitions of the global biodiversity framework. Thus, the minimum standard is the Cunningham Global Biodiversity Framework. We should use language, tasks, and suggested activities following the current program of work language. The tasks should be revised based on the goals and targets of the Cunningham Montreal GBV. Principal goals and targets should be clear, concise, and simple language, so that at least people can be able to understand not only us, but also those who are out there who have not worked on the program before. Each task should be clearly identified, who will do it, what will be the task, when will it be done, and each suggested activities are, the current suggested activities are too broad, and some of them are not clear. As example, the previous program of work identified parties, CBD Secretariat, and the working group on Article AJ, and now we should identify in each task parties, working group, and permanent body, and then the CBD Secretariat, and all society approach. Each task should include elements to monitor and implement the taking account that issues related to indicators for target related to IPLCs is still work in progress. So we still need to really make sure that we look at it very clearly. The program of work must be in line with the goals and targets of the GBV and cannot be considered in isolation, as we had already indicated. We have our preliminary comments on the sections of the draft new program of work on Article AJ. And especially on this, that I'm going to give them to you. But remember, this is a continuous work that we have as IFB, and we'll continue working and improving it so that we can share it very clearly by the end of the time when we meet at the working group, or the 12th working group. In section 1, the sustainable use of biodiversity, that's target 5 and 9, IPLCs played a key roles in sustainable use of biodiversity. They use wildlife and plants for food, medicine, spiritual and cultural ceremonies. But due to that, some species are at risk in extinction. Some parties to prevent the exploitation could limit the use of these animals or plants only for legal use. For this, the target 5 include the respect of the customary sustainable use in accordance with the Article 10C of the Convention on Biological Diversity, to ensure that harvesting, trade, and use of wild species is based on respect for customary laws and practices in target 9, which is focused on values as is supposed to be on the benefit of peoples. So it's central for the implementation of the Article 10C of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And we also looking at it on customary sustainable use. And customary sustainable use defined as the use of biological resources in accordance with the traditional cultural practices compatible with the conservation of sustainable use implementation. So this is quite important for us to make sure that we have a good sustainable customary sustainable use plan of action, which is very important in order to be able to implement this. The new task use the language, wildlife, and wildlife species developing guidelines that contribute to the implementation of target 5 and 9, promote the implementation of the customary sustainable use, as I've indicated. And then section 2, conservation and restoration, target 1, 2, 3, and 4. IPLCs consider that it is important that inclusive, integrated social planning, spatial planning processes should be recognized. The right of indigenous people for the indigenous people over their lands, territories, waters, and resources, including their own management plans. Spatial planning broadly applied covers ecosystems and all land seas uses, including those under the jurisdiction of indigenous people under the customary governance and tenure. So this is quite important to make sure that at least we get all involved, especially indigenous people, in planning and discussing these issues. IPSCs, as we all know, play a role in conservation of biodiversity, and their indigenous land and traditional territories have the most important biodiversity. For this, it is also important to note that the lands, territories of indigenous people and local communities can be limited to designatories of the destination of protection, protected areas, and or OECMs in necessary to ensure the IPLC's collective land, territories, and waters have distinct recognition at all the time. And to continue, I think it's also important to look at other tasks to make sure that issues of benefit sharing are and from genetic resources are also considered, especially as we look at target 13, and a third objective of the convention on the benefit sharing for the utilization of genetic resources has not been achieved to date in the life of the convention, particularly benefit sharing with the IPLCs for utilization of traditional knowledge. The global biodiversity framework contains its objective C and target that action will be taken will take effective legal policy the objectives IPLC get the fair and equitable benefit from the use of their traditional knowledge. And one of the tasks should for the working group or for the permanent body to develop action that could make
I think we lost Lucy. Then let's provide 2 minutes so she could reconnect. I see
sorry,
her.
it looks like I lost a bit. Yes, I'm there now.
Okay, great. This,
Sorry about. And section 4, knowledge and cultural goals, C, target 21-22, traditional knowledge is part of the culture. This section need to consider the adoption of the COP15, then joint program of work on the links between biological and cultural diversity, nature and culture, which is also very, very important for us. Some task for the new program of work is to support IPLCs to strengthen the intergenerational transition and use of traditional knowledge, including through their own cultural knowledge and educational centers. Section 4, protection of the indigenous people and local communities and traditional knowledge, innovation and practices, including throughout application and guidelines and standards, and future advancement of Article 8 and related provision, goals 21 and 22, just to go up to try and summarize up. This section is important due to the progress in the recognition of the role of traditional knowledge in biodiversity conservation. That traditional knowledge will guide the decision-making for the effective management of biological diversity, as traditional knowledge could be part of the informing decision-making in its important to high and to that traditional knowledge can only be used respecting the free prior informed consent of IPLCs when considering traditional knowledge, which is in the Article 8J. And there is a lot to work on, especially to achieve target 22 of the GBV. And section 6, full and effective participation of indigenous people, which was really very, and local communities, target 22 and 23, which has already been covered a lot by CAPAC. As IPLCs maintain in their land and territories the most important biodiversity, participation of indigenous people in decision-making on issues related to biodiversity is key. They could be effective for measures taken in on biodiversity in target 22. And this is very important that we look at them in very keen area. Some of the tasks of the new program of work are to support the full and effective participation, as we have already said, and looking at different action. It's very important to ensure that indigenous people are really included. We consider in line, as we've been discussing as indigenous people, that the Kumeng Morial GBV, important to include a new section on the IPLC's direct access to funding for conservation. And as a task could be the development of guidelines to the mechanism, legislation, and other appropriate initiatives of direct access funding for IPLC's biodiversity conservation. These are only initials to analyze the work of IFB and to continue to discuss the suggested areas that we have already put in place. Regarding the future institutional arrangements, which has already been well tabulated by Dr. Woku on the modus operandi, full and effective participation, including the leadership roles, taking to account the diversity and indigenous people and respecting their own procedures and structures. A permanent open-ended intergovernmental body ensuring consistency and continuity mechanism of practices to ensure indigenous peoples is in decision making is very important. An inclusive body which is not expert body, as we were trying to recommend ourselves. But as we said, this is work that we are continuing doing it, discussing and making sure that we develop something that can be helpful to us in future, and also that we can continue working and ensuring full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. And we hope that as we continue discussing these practices, the final COP16, as indicated with the historical mandate on the 1998 and 2000, will be something that we can achieve. And we really thank you all for giving us this opportunity. Thank you.
I'll come in.
Thank you, Lucy, for your presentation, and yes, we would like to congratulate the extensive consultation and coordination among indigenous people and local communities within the IFB. Thank you for highlighting the elements of the GBF as well with the new program of work. Definitely the recommendation from COP15 says that the new program of work should align with the outcomes of the COP15, mainly with the Kumeng Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. I thank you all the speakers and presenters for providing such detailed background and information for the consideration regarding the development of the new program of work and institutional arrangement. We now move to take some questions. Participants have are asked to please post your questions via the Q&A box found at the bottom of the panel. So we received several questions. I just want to make sure that, yes, David should join us soon. But we have some questions. Well, we have some practical questions regards about the copies and of this presentation and the recording. Just to highlight that, yes, at the website we will make available the recording of this presentation in the three languages, and as well the PowerPoint presentation. Christina Onoli is asking us about the composition of the ATHEC, and just to respond on that, COP15 decided include the terms of reference of the terms of reference for the ATHEC and the composition of the ATHEC in Annex 3 of Decision 15/10, which includes 3 representatives nominated by parties. The total will be 15. 2 representatives nominated by IPLCs for the 7 regions. The total would be 14, and up to 6 other observers could nominate. The total composition would be 35 experts for the APEC. We have questions for Woku from Edna Fernandez, and Edna is asking about how, if we could explain a little further on how the working group is relevant to the Cartagena Protocol and the meetings of parties of the Cartagena Protocol. Let me see if we have also additional question. This question may be addressed, could be a response by Lucy and Viviana. I would like to welcome Viviana as part of the IFB. They're asking us about, in the context from the Pakistan, the relation between conservation and restoration. From the experience in this context, there was a gap between the lack of sustainability and implementation. How to experiment with new conservation programs at the border scale. And again, I think we can learn from indigenous people's experience on regards to conservation and preservation. We also have a question from Mauricio, and this is in regards to the Annex 2. There are 7 suggested activities under section of sustainable use. Some are overlapping with the 3 tasks of the first phase of the Global Plan of Action on Customized Sustainable Use. Could we clarify what would happen with the Global Plan of Action on Customized Sustainable Use? Will this be revised on or updated? Yes, that's the question. And yes, let me stop there. We're still compiling more questions as we receive it. But let me give the floor first to Woku to address the question on the Cartagena Protocol, and maybe then I would like to invite Lucy and Diana to address the questions on conservation and restoration, and I will go over the question on the plan of action. Woku?
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Kapaj, and thank you for the distinguished participant who raised this question. Without going into much detail, in the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, at least there is one important provision that makes explicit reference to indigenous peoples and local communities. That is Article 26 on socioeconomic considerations. Parties to the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety have the option to take into account socioeconomic considerations in taking a decision whether to import or to introduce living modified organisms into their territory. And in doing so, they are expected to take into account the value of biological diversity, among other things, the value of biological diversity to the indigenous peoples and local communities. So this is one explicit reference that has actually triggered a very long process of discussion, review of this article, the extent of implementation of this article, etc. And as far as I remember, when I was in biosafety unit, we were working on this particular provision involving representatives of indigenous peoples and local communities in our discussion. This is one area that shows relevance, but the entire provision on risk assessment and risk management, which is in the Cartagena Protocol, which is at the center of Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, requires, of course, the risks to be identified and managed within the context of the interest of indigenous and local communities as agreed, as accepted by the convention itself. For example, Article 8G talks about, of course, subject to national legislation, about respecting the innovation practices and lifestyles, etc., of living modified and of IPLCs. So when a living modified organism is introduced in a certain area, whether that area or territory is IPLCs, indigenous peoples territory, or area where there are different species of importance of crops, livestock, etc. Risk assessment by its very nature has to take wider elements into account, and one of the most important things to take into account in the context of assessing the risk and managing the risk of introducing living modified organisms would be the implication on IPLCs, on their lifestyle, on their innovation practices, and on their resources, on their territories. So that's what I can say at this stage. Of course, the Nagoya Protocol is straightforward. Traditional knowledge is all over the place in the Nagoya Protocol, so its relevance is very clear and straightforward. Thank you.
Thank you, Woku. I would like now to invite IFB to address the questions in regards to the role of indigenous peoples in conservation and restoration. Yes, Viviana.
Thank you. The IIFV was discussing this during the negotiations of the global framework. We were able to have it included in target 1, not 2, but we did it because we believe the indigenous people have an essential role in conservation, and we have in target 3 a mention in the 2 sections, we have a mention of indigenous peoples. And in this specific case, what we have done within IIFB is to analyze the document which is annexed to that has already a section related to conservation and restoration, and all the modifications that we are suggesting are related to the support or to have guidelines that will help to implement target 3 as well as target 1 and 2. Therefore, for us, the document from the last working group meeting, contact group, was part of target 2. It has to be updated and reviewed in detail in line with the 3 targets. And of course, one of the things that we believe in the next years we have to discuss is the implementation of the global framework. And of course, in future years, we need to work so that we can have guidelines that will help for the implementation. And of course, we have examples like the IPBES study regarding the state of biodiversity, and also the sustainable use of biodiversity. We have a lot of examples there how indigenous peoples contribute to conservation and restoration of biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Viviana. Let me as well, we have many questions and we'll do our best to respond all of them, including if we don't have enough time, because we have 10 minutes to close the session, we will follow up via email. But just in regards to the process, there's the questions on the number of representatives of indigenous people during the Ad-Hoc again, and we have 2 IPLC representatives per the 7 sociocultural regions as identified by the UN, and this is the classic regions that are recognized by the UN Permanent Forum, as well the EMPRE mechanisms within the Human Rights Council. Yes, indeed, there's other, let's say, seats for 6 observers, which include international organizations. On regards to Mauricio questions on the global plan of action, customized sustainable use, yes, actually, this is a very important point, which will be addressed by the Ad-Hoc. And again, it will be really useful if this comment or question or approach or suggestion could also be presented in the form of the peer review process that we, as you have heard, we extend the deadline for the submissions. We have some questions in regards of the just adopted BBNJ outcome that took place over last week. Again, this is a new element, and it will be up to the parties, observers, to highlight these new elements. You can do it again via the peer review process, and again, the Ad-Hoc will consider the results of the Ad-Hoc of the peer review. We have a question from Reynaldo Morales to WOCU. If maybe we could expand a little bit or clarify on the institutional mechanisms for the consideration of the new program of work, how they could submit comments. Or maybe I could add to that, or I will let WOCU to reply on that, but I can also add something. We have a question from Maxwell Mendoza, or for AFP, in regards to the use of new technologies such as synthetic biology and digital sequencing. Are these for the consideration for the AFP and the new program of work? There is a question on as well for WOCU from Kate Bername. With regards to the institution arrangement, option A on establishing a subsidiary body, and option C, enhance integrate participation, are necessarily distinctive. The permanent body, option A, it's essentially in her view, could enhance the participation of in option C. And yes, perhaps there could be identified, we could look at established bodies such as the local communities, indigenous people platform under the UNCCC process. And yes, maybe I can invite Woku to address the questions on the institutional arrangement. And yeah, I will add to that as well. And then I will also compile questions for IFP. Woku.
Yeah, what was the first question? I didn't get it fully, the first one. The second one I did.
Yes. Sorry, I'm trying to find. Could you explain on the Cartagena?
Yeah, I did that.
Yes, in regards to how they could provide comments to the discussion on the institutional arrangement. This question goes because we have the peer review for Annex 2, but then the process to provide comments on the institutional arrangement.
So you have already answered that, responded to that question. But to the question regarding whether the one option, for example, the subsidiary body, creating a subsidiary body on Article 8J necessarily, is exclusive with the third option, which is enhanced participation, but integrating it into fully integrating the work program into the convention processes, including the convention institutions. I would say this, yes, probably COP16 would like to choose one of the options, but however, that doesn't necessarily mean that elements there are no elements that are common to all the options. So some of the features, for example, as I said in my presentation earlier, actually, some of the features that have been developed over the years, in fact, what we consider them at this stage as best practices within the context of the working group, the ad hoc working group on Article 8J, could simply be transferred to a subsidiary body if the parties choose to create a subsidiary body of a permanent type. A number of the elements or the features in the workings of the ad hoc working group will be in fact be part of the operation of and the functions of the new subsidiary body. In the third option, which is integrating into the work of the convention without necessarily having a distinct body exclusively assigned to the work on the implementation of Article 8J. Some of the elements regarding, for example, participation should in fact be followed, implemented, continued in an enhanced form, an enhanced rate. That is what, in fact, our decision 1417 is saying. Participation should be enhanced. The mechanisms of participation that are put in place during the working group, the ad hoc working group, should be able to be, to continue to the extent they are efficient, to the extent they allow the operation of the other subsidiary bodies, the other processes within the CBD to be efficient and effective. So some elements would be, of course, distinct and therefore exclude other elements, and there are a number of common elements that could apply to one or more of the options. So this could be, of course, considered by the COP, considered by these preparatory processes, and then finally by the COP when it decides which option to go. Thank you.
Thank you. I will try to answer some of the questions, and then I will invite IFB Viviana, who maybe many of the questions that we received from IFB is regards to the participation and the substantive contributions from IPLCs to conservation. Many of the questions is how this contribution could find its way to the international level. And I think, again, the role of the IFB plays their important role to develop this channel between the local and the international level. So maybe after us addressing some of this question, I will give the floor to Viviana to address that. But again, from the questions for the Secretariat, there are two important questions that I think. First one is regard to the process to the indicators. As you might know, the process of indicators is basically led by the SABSTA process. However, the next session of the working group will also look at the 4 TK indicators based on the decision on the joint program of work on nature and culture, which invites the working group on Article 8J and SABSTA to update and review the 4 traditional knowledge indicators. Now, in order not to create a parallel process for indicators for the GBF and the 4 TK indicators, it aims that the next session of the working group will provide, consider and will work with the ATHEC on indicators, and it provides its comment to the next session, to the second session prior to COP16, to the SABSTA session, who will actually prepare the draft recommendations for COP16. It's aimed that the working group address the indicators next session and put it in front of the SABSTA prior to the COP16. There are also questions in regards to indigenous languages and how this is part of the GBF. Well, as COP15 adopt the GBF, it also adopts several decisions, programs, tools, and instruments that help with the implementation of the GBF. One of them being the nature, the joint program on links between cultural and biological diversity, which includes among its element and task work on indigenous languages. The next session of the working group on Article 8J will initiate with the in-depth dialogue on the role of indigenous languages in the transmission of traditional knowledge. For both, for indicators and indigenous language, we will issue soon a notification inviting parties and observers to provide comments to help to develop the precisional documents for these 2 items for the next session of the working group. I stop there, and then I would like to give the IFB some comments again in regards to the role that IFB plays between linking the local and the international processes, particularly in the context of developing the new program of work. Viviana?
Sí, muchas gracias, Capac. Desde el Foro Internacional
thank you,
Indígena
Capac.
estamos haciendo.
From IFB, as our co-chair mentioned, Lucy Malenke, we are discussing, we are meeting throughout the week. So for all of you who are indigenous representatives or local community representatives who would like to attend, you're more than welcome to write us to participate. We want to analyze deeply, discuss and reflect on the document, the Annex 2 of COP15, those issues related to Article 8J, and we review the Community Montreal post-2020, the biodiversity framework. So we review all these different documentation, and what is more important is that this new work program actually support, enhance IPLCs and contribute at local, but also international level. So we have these open dialogues with several brothers and sisters from the different regions that Lucy mentioned, so that we can have and find a common ground. It takes some time, as you may know, because we want to deeply analyze the content. I have checked some of the questions on what is our specific position of digital sequencing, for instance, and among different points, there are several processes where these discussions are taking place, and IFV is also following up those discussions. So in future days, we will be also analyzing the inclusion or not as part of a task of the work program. This is a specific point because there are several processes that are taking place in parallel, and we do not want duplication. But I would like to thank you all participants, and I would like to send the invitation. If you have contribution or ideas, please reach to us. We would really like this work program to be relevant to enhance what IPLCs do at the local level to protect biodiversity. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Liliana. I
Thank
thank
you,
you everyone
Liliana.
for your questions. We're still receiving some questions, but unfortunately we have to close this webinar. Yes, Woko, if you would like to take the floor again to respond Dr. Mustafa's question, please.
Yeah, very shortly to Dr. Mustafa's question, which is an important question. I know, Kapaj, you have said rightly so that this is a new item that we need to consider further in our process. But this is an important area, the new agreement that was concluded last weekend in New York on biological resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Of course, the CBD as a whole has a strong interest in this treaty, in this regulation, because it has some mandates in areas beyond, in areas within the national jurisdiction, as well as in areas beyond national jurisdiction. As you probably know, the convention has a provision on jurisdictional scope under its Article 4, and that jurisdictional scope provides that the CBD will have no mandate when it comes to components within national components of biological diversity in areas within the limits of its national jurisdiction. It will have jurisdiction on components within the limits of national jurisdiction. And when it comes to activities and processes, wherever the effects of those activities and processes occur, as long as these activities and processes are originated in areas within the limits of national jurisdiction, then the CBD has a mandate. There is a complex relationship between the CBD and the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. So to the extent the convention allows us to get to be part of course, the CBD process will have an interest in the implementation, in the understanding, in the interpretation, in the understanding and implementation of this new agreement when it comes into force. So a new area, a new discussion on this new agreement is probably important, as Dr. Mustafa implied. Thank you.
Thank you, Uku, for that important remark. And yes, unfortunately, we need to close the session now. We are over 7 minutes. But yeah, we will do our best to put the questions, that many of them are similar, and we will include a kind of section for Q&A in the website. So I invite you to look at we might address some of the questions as well there in the website of the webinar. That I would like to thank you all of you for the very interesting and engaging overview of the development of the new program of work and institutional arrangement on Article 8J and other provisions. My sincere thanks goes to David, Cooper, Woku, Lucy, and Viviana for taking the time to participate and speak and respond to questions. I thank you, the participants, for joining us today and sharing your insights and perspective. I wish also to thank the interpreters for their efficient support. If you have further questions, please always contact the secretariat at secretariat@cbd.int and let us our dialogue en route to the next meeting of the working group on Article 8J and beyond. That we close this webinar. Thank you, everyone.